Sometimes the hardest hearts hold the deepest wounds, and sometimes it takes the innocent eyes of children to remind us who we used to be. In 1880s New Mexico, Wyeth Calloway was the richest man in a dying town. He owned thousands of acres, fine cattle, and a gold pocket watch that gleamed in the desert sun. But all his wealth couldn't fill the emptiness where his heart used to be. Everyone knew Wyeth as a cold, bitter man who kept to himself. So when three orphan brothers showed up at his ranch, dusty and desperate, nobody expected what happened next. Benjamin, Matthew, and David Fletcher had lost everything and had nowhere else to turn. Their simple plea for help would change everything Wyeth thought he knew about himself. But what this lonely cowboy did for those boys would shock everyone who thought they knew him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story moves you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Calloway ranch as Wyeth pulled the gold pocket watch from his vest and checked the time. 6:30, same as every morning for the past 15 years. The watch had belonged to his father and his father's father before that, but the weight of it in his palm felt heavier now than it ever had. Time, he'd learned, was the cruelest master of all. He closed the watch with a soft click and surveyed his domain from the wide porch of his adobe ranch house. 15,000 acres of the finest grazing land in New Mexico territory stretched before him, dotted with prime Hereford cattle that bore his brand. The Calloway Sea was known from Santa Fe to El Paso as a mark of quality, and men paid top dollar for his beef. Yet standing there in the crisp morning air, Wyeth felt as empty as the vast sky above. The town of Cedar Falls lay 3 miles to the east, though town was a generous description these days. What had once been a thriving community of nearly 2,000 souls had dwindled to fewer than 300. The silver mine that had brought prosperity to the region had played out 5 years ago, and families had been trickling away ever since, chasing opportunities in California or returning to relatives back east. The businesses that remained: Murphy's General Store, the Cedar Falls Saloon, Dr. Helena Morrison's clinic, and the small schoolhouse, survived mainly because of Wyeth's patronage and the handful of other ranchers who'd chosen to stay. Wyeth descended the porch steps with measured stride, his boots echoing on the worn wooden planks. At 52, he remained an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with steel-gray hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face, weathered by decades under the southwestern sun, bore lines that spoke of hard living and harder losses. Those who did business with him respected his word as much as they feared his temper, though few had seen either in recent years. "Morning, Senor Calloway," called Miguel Herrera from beside the corral, where he was checking the legs of a bay mare. Miguel had worked the ranch for 8 years, ever since his own small spread had failed during the drought of '75. He was one of only 3 hands Wyeth kept year-round, the others being his nephew Carlos and old Pete Donovan, who'd been breaking horses since before the war. "Miguel," Wyeth acknowledged with a nod. "How's the mare?" "She'll be fine, senor. Just a stone bruise. A few days' rest, and she'll be good as new." Wyeth grunted his approval and continued toward the barn. Miguel watched him go, noting the familiar pattern. Every morning, the same routine. Check the watch, survey the land, speak only when necessary, then lose himself in work until darkness fell. It was no way for a man to live, in Miguel's opinion. But Senor Calloway had built walls around his heart that seemed too high for anyone to scale. Inside the barn, Wyeth moved through his morning chores with practiced efficiency. Feed the horses, check the tack, review the breeding records he kept in meticulous detail. His Herefords were among the finest stock in the territory, bred for hardiness and quality meat. The work was demanding but predictable, and predictability had become his refuge. As he worked, his mind drifted to the locked drawer in his desk, where a faded photograph lay hidden beneath legal papers and ranch accounts. He tried not to think about it, but mornings were the worst times. In the early light, when the world was quiet and his defenses were down, memories had a way of creeping in like smoke under a door. Catherine's smile, bright as summer sunshine. Little Thomas's first steps across the parlor floor. The fever that had taken them both in the span of a week, leaving Wyeth with nothing but emptiness and the bitter taste of regret. He'd been in Colorado on a cattle-buying trip when the sickness struck, chasing profit while his family needed him most. By the time he'd received word and raced home, there had been nothing left but 2 fresh graves in the Cedar Falls Cemetery. That was 17 years ago, and the wound still felt as raw as the day it was made. A commotion outside broke through his dark reverie. Voices carried on the morning air, Miguel shouting something in rapid Spanish, then Pete's gravelly tones, urgent and concerned. Wyeth set down the feed bucket and strode to the barn door, squinting against the brilliant sunlight. 3 figures stood near the ranch gate, small and dusty and clearly exhausted. Even from a distance, Wyeth could see they were children, though what children would be wandering alone in this desolate country was beyond his comprehension. Miguel and Pete flanked them, their body language protective, and Wyeth felt a familiar irritation rise in his chest. He had no patience for unexpected visitors, especially when they looked like trouble. He approached the group with deliberate slowness, taking in details as he drew closer. 3 boys, the oldest perhaps 13, the youngest no more than 10. Their clothes were worn but clean, their faces streaked with trail dust and exhaustion. They stood close together, the 2 younger ones slightly behind their older brother, who faced Wyeth with a mixture of determination and fear. Found them at the gate. "Boss," Pete said, pushing back his battered hat. "Been walking all night from the look of them. We're looking for Mr. Wyeth Calloway," the oldest boy said, his voice cracking slightly. "Are you him?" Wyeth studied the boy's face, noting the sharp cheekbones and the stubborn set of his jaw. There was something familiar about him, though Wyeth couldn't place what. "I am. What do you want?" The boy swallowed hard, his courage visibly wavering under Wyeth's cold stare. "Sir, my name is Benjamin Fletcher. These are my brothers, Matthew and David. Our parents, they're dead, sir. Our farm burned, and we got nowhere else to go. We heard that maybe I might what?" Wyeth's voice carried the edge of winter wind. Benjamin's face flushed, but he pressed on. "Help us, sir. We can work. We're strong and we learn fast. We don't eat much and we won't cause trouble. I don't need more hands," Wyeth cut him off. "And I don't run a charity for strays." The words hit the boys like physical blows. The youngest, David, stepped forward from behind his brothers, his dark eyes bright with unshed tears. "Please, mister, we walked for 3 days to get here. Mama said, before she died, she said you were a good man who'd help folks in need." Something twisted in Wyeth's chest at the child's words, but he pushed the feeling down. He'd learned long ago that caring led only to loss, and he'd lost enough for one lifetime. "Your mama was mistaken. Pete, give them some water and point them toward town. Maybe someone there will take pity on them." He turned to walk away, but David's voice stopped him. "We got money," the boy said desperately. "Not much, but we can pay you something. Please don't make us go away. We're scared, and we don't know where else to turn." Wyeth looked back over his shoulder, taking in the sight of 3 orphaned children clinging to each other in the middle of nowhere. David was fumbling in his pocket, producing a small leather pouch that likely contained their entire worldly wealth. The gesture was so heartbreakingly earnest that Wyeth felt his carefully constructed walls waver. For a moment, he saw another child's face, Thomas's sweet smile, the way he'd toddle across the room with his arms outstretched, calling "Papa! Papa!" in his piping voice. The memory was so sharp and unexpected that Wyeth nearly staggered under its weight. "Boss?" Pete's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You all right?" Wyeth blinked, forcing himself back to the present. The 3 Fletcher boys watched him with a mixture of hope and terror, their entire future hanging on his next words. He could see in their faces the same desperate need that had once driven him to build this empire of cattle and land, the need for security, for belonging, for something permanent in a world that seemed determined to take everything away. but he also saw the inevitable heartache that came with caring. These boys would grow up, move on, maybe die young like so many did in this harsh country. Getting attached would only lead to more pain, and Wyeth had sworn long ago never to open himself to that kind of hurt again. Still, something in young David's eyes reminded him of the man he used to be, before grief had hardened his heart into stone. That man would never have turned away 3 orphaned children. That man had believed in helping others, in doing what was right simply because it was right. Maybe that man wasn't entirely dead after all. One night, he heard himself say, the words coming out before he could stop them. You can stay one night, get cleaned up and fed. Tomorrow, you find somewhere else to go. The relief on the boys' faces was almost painful to witness. Benjamin straightened his shoulders and extended his hand like a man. Thank you, sir. We're grateful for your kindness. Wyeth stared at the offered hand for a long moment before shaking it briefly. The boy's grip was firm despite his youth, his palm calloused from hard work. Miguel will show you where to wash up. We eat at 6 sharp. As he walked back toward the house, Wyeth pulled out his pocket watch again, though he'd checked it less than an hour ago. The weight of it felt different somehow, as if those 3 dusty children had shifted something fundamental in the careful balance of his world. Behind him, he heard Miguel speaking gently to the boys in his accented English, offering words of comfort and welcome that Wyeth couldn't bring himself to voice. Tomorrow, he told himself firmly. Tomorrow they would be gone, and his life would return to its orderly, predictable routine. He had no way of knowing that by tomorrow everything would have changed forever. The Fletcher boys had walked for 3 days and 2 nights across the New Mexican desert, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs, a small pouch of coins, and a charred wooden cross that Benjamin clutched like a talisman. The cross was all that remained of their family's homestead, pulled from the ashes of what had once been their mother's garden. 2 weeks earlier, their world had been whole. Their father, James Fletcher, worked a modest farm 30 miles east of Cedar Falls, coaxing corn and beans from the stubborn earth, while their mother, Ruth, tended the vegetable garden and kept house. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And they'd been happy in the way that families are when they have each other and hope for tomorrow. The fire had started in the barn during the night, though they never learned how. Benjamin had awakened to the smell of smoke and his father's urgent voice calling for everyone to get out. By the time they'd stumbled from their beds, flames were already licking at the house's wooden walls. Driven by a fierce wind that seemed to feed the blaze's hunger. Take your brothers and run to the creek, their father had shouted over the roar of the fire. Don't look back, no matter what you hear. That was the last time Benjamin saw his parents alive. He'd grabbed Matthew and David by their nightshirts and pulled them stumbling through the smoke toward the water, even as they cried for their mother and father. Behind them, the night sky glowed orange with destruction, and the sound of collapsing timbers echoed across the prairie like gunshots. They'd huddled by the creek until dawn, watching their entire world burn to ash. When the flames finally died and they crept back to what had been their home, they found 2 bodies in what remained of the kitchen, overcome by smoke as they'd tried to save their few precious possessions. Their mother's arms were wrapped around a wooden box containing their family Bible and a few letters from relatives back east. The neighbors who came to help with the burial were kind but poor themselves, with barely enough to feed their own families. One by one they'd explained why they couldn't take in 3 more mouths, their voices heavy with genuine regret. Benjamin understood times were hard, and charity was a luxury few could afford. There's a man named Wyeth Calloway, old Mrs. Patterson had said, as she packed what food she could spare into a canvas sack. Owns a big spread west of Cedar Falls, rich as creases and hard as nails. But your mama always said he was decent underneath. Might be he'd give you boys work. It was their only hope, and Benjamin had seized it with the desperate determination of a 13-year-old suddenly responsible for his younger brothers' lives. They'd buried their parents beneath the old oak tree where their mother used to hang laundry, marked the graves with stones from the creek, and set out across the desert with nothing but faith and stubbornness to guide them. The journey had been harder than Benjamin imagined. Water was scarce, and the October nights grew cold enough to make them huddle together for warmth. Matthew had twisted his ankle on the second day, and David had developed a cough that worried Benjamin more than he let on. They'd survived on Mrs. Patterson's hardtack and jerky, rationing each bite and drinking from muddy cattle tanks when they could find them. On the final night, as they sheltered in an abandoned line shack with David burning with fever, Benjamin had almost given up hope. His youngest brother was so weak he could barely walk, and Matthew's ankle had swollen to twice its normal size. Maybe they should have stayed and hoped for charity from the neighbors. Maybe this desperate gamble would end with all three of them dying alone in the desert. But when dawn broke and David's fever had eased, Benjamin found new resolve. They'd come too far to quit now. Their parents were counting on him to keep his brothers safe, and he couldn't let them down now. Standing in Wyeth Calloway's ranch yard, with the man's cold grey eyes boring into him, Benjamin felt every one of those desperate miles in his bones. This was their last chance, and if Calloway turned them away, he didn't know what they'd do. "We're not asking for charity," Benjamin had said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We can work. I'm strong for my age, and Matthew's good with animals. David's only 10, but he's smart and willing." Calloway's expression hadn't changed. "What happened to your parents?" "Fire took them," Benjamin replied simply. "Burned our whole place to the ground. Nothing left but ashes and memories." Something had flickered in the rancher's eyes at those words, gone so quickly Benjamin might have imagined it. But when David stepped forward with his pitiful offer of payment, Benjamin saw the man's carefully controlled facade crack just slightly. The moment stretched between them like a held breath. Benjamin could feel his brother's fear, could sense the ranch hand's sympathy, could almost taste the hope that hung in the morning air. This was the fulcrum point, the moment when their future would be decided by a stranger's mercy or lack thereof. When Calloway finally spoke, offering them one night's shelter, Benjamin felt his knees go weak with relief. It wasn't much, but it was something. A foot in the door, a chance to prove their worth. He'd take it and be grateful. "Thank you, sir," he managed, extending his hand the way his father had taught him. "We won't forget your kindness." Calloway's handshake was brief and businesslike. But Benjamin thought he detected something else beneath the surface, a recognition. Perhaps of one survivor acknowledging another. Miguel Herrera proved to be a godsend, leading them to a bunkhouse behind the main barn where they could wash the trail dust from their skin and rest their aching feet. The Mexican ranch hand spoke English with a musical accent, his voice warm, with the kind of compassion Benjamin hadn't heard since before the fire. "You boys are safe now," Miguel assured them as he pumped water into a wash basin. "Senor Calloway, he is not as hard as he pretends. You will see." "He said we can only stay one night," Matthew said, wincing as he eased his weight off his injured ankle. Miguel's dark eyes held understanding beyond his years. "Sometimes one night becomes two, and sometimes two becomes more. The heart, it works in mysterious ways, especially the heart that has been broken." Benjamin wanted to ask what he meant by that. But David was swaying on his feet with exhaustion, and Matthew needed to get off his ankle. There would be time for questions later, if they were lucky enough to have a later. As they cleaned up and changed into the spare clothes Miguel had found for them, Benjamin allowed himself to study their surroundings. The Calloway Ranch was impressive in a way that spoke of both wealth and hard work. The buildings were well maintained, the fences strong and straight, the cattle fat and healthy. This was a place that had been built to last, by a man who understood the value of quality and permanence. It was also, Benjamin realized, a very lonely place. Despite its size and obvious prosperity, the ranch felt oddly empty. Apart from Miguel and the other two hands they'd glimpsed, there was no sign of family, no children's laughter, no woman's touch in the spare functionality of the buildings. It was as if Wyeth Calloway had built himself a fortress against the world, successful but solitary. When the dinner bell rang at 6 sharp, the boys made their way to the main house with Miguel. Calloway sat at the head of a long wooden table that could have seated 12, but held only place settings for 6. The meal was simple but abundant: beef stew, fresh bread, and milk still warm from the morning milking. Calloway said grace in a voice that suggested the habit was more duty than devotion, then ate in silence while the boys tried to mind their manners despite their hunger. It was David who finally broke the quiet. "This is the best food we've had in weeks," he said earnestly. "Thank you for sharing it with us." Calloway looked up from his plate, studying the youngest Fletcher boy with those storm-grey eyes. For a moment, his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Eat up. You're too thin." It wasn't much, but coming from a man who seemed to guard his words like gold coins, it felt like a small victory. Benjamin caught Miguel's eye across the table and saw the older man's slight nod of approval. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance after all. Morning came too soon and not soon enough. Benjamin had lain awake most of the night, listening to his brother's steady breathing and wrestling with plans that seemed to dissolve as quickly as he formed them. If Calloway held firm to his one-night limit, where would they go? Back to the neighbors who'd already explained they couldn't help. To Cedar Falls, to throw themselves on the mercy of strangers? The sound of boots on gravel announced the start of the ranch's day, and Benjamin roused his brothers with gentle shakes. David's cough had eased during the night, and Matthew's ankle, while still tender, bore his weight better than it had the day before. Small mercies, but Benjamin had learned to be grateful for any kindness fate chose to offer. They dressed quickly in their cleaned clothes and made their way to the main house, uncertain of the protocol, but hoping to demonstrate their usefulness before Calloway could send them away. They found him on the front porch, coffee cup in hand, studying the morning sky with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent decades reading weather signs. "Thank you for the bed and the meal," Benjamin said formally. "We'll be on our way now unless what?" Calloway's voice held no warmth, but no particular hostility either. Benjamin swallowed his pride and pressed forward. "Unless you might have some work for us. Just for a few days to earn our keep. We're not afraid of hard labor." Calloway's grey eyes shifted to Matthew, who was trying not to favor his injured ankle, then to David, who despite his brave front was clearly still recovering from his bout with fever. "Boy looks like a strong wind would blow him over. And your brother can barely walk." "I can work," David said quickly. "I helped Papa with the animals back home. I know how to milk cows and feed chickens and muck stalls." "We all do," Matthew added, straightening despite his discomfort. "Our Papa taught us that everybody pulls their weight no matter how old they are." Something in their earnest determination seemed to give Calloway pause. He sipped his coffee and considered them over the rim of his cup, his expression unreadable. Just when Benjamin was certain they'd be sent away, the rancher spoke. "Miguel could use help with the morning chores. Few days of that, we'll see how you work out." His tone suggested this was a business decision, nothing more. "But I'm not running a charity. You don't earn your keep, you don't stay." Relief flooded through Benjamin so powerfully he felt lightheaded. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. We won't let you down." Calloway grunted and disappeared into the house, leaving the boys standing on the porch with grins threatening to split their faces. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was time. Time to prove themselves, time to figure out what came next. Miguel appeared at their sides like a guardian angel, his weathered face creased with a smile. "Come, muchachos, let me show you how we do things on the Calloway Ranch." The next few days fell into a pattern that felt almost like the normal life they'd lost. Miguel proved to be a patient teacher, showing them the proper way to care for the horses, how to repair fence line, and the dozen small tasks that kept a ranch running smoothly. David, despite his size, had a natural way with animals that impressed even Pete Donovan, who'd been working cattle since before the boys were born. "Kids got the touch," Pete observed, watching David calm a skittish mare with soft words and gentle hands. "It reminds me of myself at that age, before the world taught me to be suspicious of everything." Matthew's ankle healed quickly, and soon he was working alongside Carlos, Miguel's nephew, learning to read cattle brands and spot signs of illness in the herd. His quiet intelligence and willingness to listen made him a favorite among the hands. Benjamin threw himself into the heaviest work he could find, determined to prove his worth through sheer effort. He hauled feed, repaired tools, and worked from dawn to dusk with a dedication that bordered on desperation. This was their chance, maybe their only one, and he wouldn't let it slip away through laziness or lack of commitment. Calloway watched it all with the detached interest of a man evaluating livestock. He rarely spoke directly to the boys, but Benjamin caught him observing their work with what might have been approval. It was hard to tell, with a man who seemed to have trained himself not to show emotion. On the fourth evening, as they sat around the bunkhouse table sharing a simple supper, David pulled something from his pocket that made Benjamin's breath catch. It was a small wooden horse, carved from a piece of scrap pine, with careful attention to detail. The proportions were perfect, and David had even managed to capture a sense of movement in the horse's flowing mane. "When did you make that?" Matthew asked, reaching out to touch the smooth wood. "Been working on it during rest breaks," David said shyly. "Thought maybe I could give it to Mr. Calloway, to say thank you for letting us stay." Miguel, who had been teaching David how to work with wood during their free time, beamed with pride. "It is beautiful work, pequeño. Your hands have a gift." Benjamin felt a knot of worry form in his stomach. "David, I don't think Mr. Calloway isn't the kind of man who appreciates gifts. He might think you're trying to butter him up." "I'm not," David said earnestly. "I just want him to know we're grateful. Papa always said a man should show appreciation for kindness, even if it's just doing what's expected." Before Benjamin could argue further, the bunkhouse door opened and Calloway himself stepped inside. The boys scrambled to their feet, but he waved them back down with an impatient gesture. "Miguel, I need you to ride out to the south pasture tomorrow. Some of the fence posts are loose, and I don't want cattle wandering onto government land." "Si, patron. I will take Carlos and take the older boy," Calloway said, his gaze flicking to Benjamin. "Time he learned something besides mucking stalls." Benjamin's heart leaped. To be trusted with real ranch work, to ride out with Miguel, it felt like acceptance, or at least a step toward it. David, who had been clutching the wooden horse behind his back, suddenly stepped forward. "Mr. Calloway, sir, I made something for you." He held out the carved horse with both hands, his face bright with nervous hope. Benjamin held his breath, waiting for Calloway's reaction. The rancher's face went completely still as he looked down at the offering, and for a moment Benjamin feared he was angry. Then Calloway reached out and took the horse, turning it over in his weathered hands with surprising gentleness. His grey eyes studied every detail of David's work, and some carefully guarded emotion flickered across his features. "This is fine craftsmanship," he said quietly. "Your father teach you to carve?" "A little," David admitted. "But Miguel's been showing me more. He says I have good hands for it." Calloway looked up at Miguel, who nodded confirmation. "The boy has natural talent, patron. With practice, he could make beautiful things." For a long moment Calloway stared at the wooden horse, lost in thoughts none of them could fathom. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. "I'll treasure it," he said simply, then turned and walked out into the night. The boys sat in stunned silence until Miguel broke into a wide grin. "I told you, muchachos. The heart, it works in mysterious ways." 3 weeks into their stay at the Calloway Ranch, the boys had settled into a rhythm that felt increasingly like home. Benjamin rode out with Miguel each morning, learning to read the land and the cattle with the skill of a born rancher. Matthew had proven himself invaluable in the barn, his gentle touch and sharp mind making him a favorite among the horses. And David had found his calling in the workshop Miguel had set up in a corner of the old equipment shed, where he spent his afternoons carving wooden figures with growing skill and confidence. The change in the boys was remarkable, but even more surprising was the subtle transformation in Wyeth Calloway himself. Though he still maintained his gruff exterior and spoke only when necessary, there were small signs of softening that didn't go unnoticed by his longtime employees. "Patron smiled at breakfast yesterday," Miguel confided to Pete as they repaired a gate in the north pasture. "Actually smiled. When little David showed him that wooden calf he carved." Pete spat into the dust and shook his head in amazement. I've been working for that man 8 years, and I can count on one hand the times I've seen him smile. These boys are doing something to him, that's for certain. What they couldn't know was that Wyeth kept David's carved horse on his desk, where he found himself picking it up several times a day, running his fingers over the smooth wood, while memories stirred like dust in an abandoned room. The boy's gift had cracked something inside him that he'd thought permanently sealed, and the feeling was both terrifying and strangely comforting. The first real test of their fragile new arrangement came on a Tuesday morning when Dr. Helena Morrison arrived at the ranch in her buggy, her black bag in hand, and concern creasing her brow. Dr. Morrison was one of the few people in Cedar Falls who dared to speak plainly to Wyeth Calloway. A widow herself, she'd come west after losing her husband in the war, determined to practice medicine in a place that desperately needed healing. She was 42 years old, with prematurely grey hair and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. "I heard you've taken in the Fletcher boys," she said without a preamble as Wyeth met her at the front door. "I wanted to check on them, make sure they're recovering properly from their ordeal." Wyeth's jaw tightened. "They're fine. Eating regular and working hard. That's good to hear, but I'd like to examine them myself if you don't mind. Malnutrition and exposure can have lasting effects, especially on children." Before Wyeth could object, David came running around the corner of the house, his face bright with excitement. "Mr. Calloway, Miguel says the new colt is ready to stand. Can we—" He stopped short when he saw Dr. Morrison, suddenly shy. "And you must be David," the doctor said warmly, crouching down to his level. "I'm Dr. Morrison. I take care of people when they're sick or hurt." David glanced at Wyeth uncertainly. "We're not sick, ma'am. Mr. Calloway's been taking real good care of us." Something in the boy's automatic defense of his host made Dr. Morrison's eyes soften. She'd heard the stories about Wyeth's cold heart and closed-off nature, but this child clearly trusted him completely. "I'm sure he has," she said gently. "But I'd still like to make sure you're all healthy and strong. Would that be all right?" The examination took place in the kitchen, with all three boys submitting to Dr. Morrison's gentle probing and questions. She pronounced them surprisingly healthy considering their recent trauma, though she recommended extra rest for David and continued careful attention to Matthew's ankle. "They're remarkable children," she told Wyeth as she packed her instruments away. "Resilient and well-mannered. Their parents did an excellent job raising them." Wyeth grunted noncommittally, but she noticed how his eyes followed David as the boy returned to his carving project on the kitchen table. "It's good for you, having them here," Dr. Morrison continued carefully. "This old place needs the sound of children's laughter." "They're not staying permanently," Wyeth said quickly, "just until I can find them proper placement." Dr. Morrison studied his face with the sharp attention of someone trained to read human nature. "Of course. But in the meantime, they're lucky to have found someone willing to take them in. Not everyone would have shown such kindness." Her words stayed with Wyeth long after she'd driven away. Kindness, was that what this was? It felt more like weakness to him, a dangerous crack in the armor he'd built around his heart. Every day the boys stayed, made it harder to imagine sending them away. And that terrified him more than he cared to admit. The crisis came 2 days later. When Benjamin got into a fight at the Cedar Falls schoolhouse, Wyeth had reluctantly agreed to let the boys attend classes. Partly because Dr. Morrison had insisted on the importance of their education, and partly because David had looked so hopeful when the subject was raised. They rode to town each morning with Miguel when he went for supplies, and walked back to the ranch in the afternoon. On this particular day, Benjamin arrived home with a split lip and scraped knuckles, his shirt torn and his face set in lines of barely controlled anger. Matthew and David flanked him protectively, their own faces bearing signs of the altercation. "What happened?" Wyeth demanded, his voice sharp with concern he didn't want to acknowledge. "Some boys were saying things," Benjamin said through gritted teeth. "About you, about us? I told them to stop, but they wouldn't listen." "What kind of things?" Benjamin hesitated, clearly reluctant to repeat the words. They said you only kept us around because you felt guilty about something, that you were getting soft in your old age, and everyone in town was laughing about it. They said," his voice broke slightly, "they said their fathers figured you'd get tired of playing daddy and throw us out before winter." The words hit Wyeth like physical blows. He'd known there would be talk. There always was in a small town when someone's behavior changed unexpectedly. But hearing it filtered through the voices of cruel children, seeing how it had hurt the boys he was coming to care about, sparked something fierce and protective in his chest. "And what did you tell them?" he asked quietly. Benjamin straightened his shoulders despite his obvious exhaustion. "I told them they didn't know what they were talking about, that you're a good man who helps people in need. And they were just jealous because their fathers aren't half the man you are." The simple faith in Benjamin's voice, the absolute conviction that Wyeth Calloway was worth defending, shattered something inside the rancher that had been frozen for 17 years. Without conscious thought, he reached out and rested his hand on the boy's shoulder. "You shouldn't have fought," he said, but his tone was gentle rather than scolding. "But I appreciate the sentiment. Are you going to send us away?" David asked in a small voice. "Because of the trouble." Wyeth looked down at the youngest Fletcher boy, seeing his own lost son's face reflected in those trusting eyes. The question demanded an answer he wasn't sure he was ready to give, but the words came anyway. "No," he said simply. "You're staying." The relief and joy that bloomed on all three faces was worth every gossip's whisper in town. The letter arrived on a grey November morning, delivered by a well-dressed man in a city suit who looked distinctly out of place among the ranch's working cowboys. Preston Blackwood introduced himself as a representative of the Territorial Development Company, and his smile was too wide and too white for Wyeth's liking. "Mr. Calloway," Blackwood said, settling uninvited into a chair on the front porch. "I trust you received our correspondence regarding your property?" Wyeth held up the unopened envelope, his expression stone cold. "If this is about selling, you can save yourself the trouble. My land isn't for sale." "Now don't be hasty," Blackwood said smoothly. "Times are changing, Mr. Calloway. The railroad is coming through, and development opportunities abound. We're prepared to offer you twice what this land is worth on paper. And I'm prepared to show you the road," Wyeth replied. "Good day, Mr. Blackwood." But Blackwood wasn't so easily dismissed. "I understand you've taken in some orphaned children recently. Admirable, truly. But raising 3 boys is expensive, and you're not getting any younger. Our offer would ensure their future education. Proper care. Get off my land." The words carried the quiet menace of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Blackwood's mask slipped slightly, revealing something harder underneath. "Mr. Calloway, I'd hate for this to become unpleasant. There are legal considerations, questions about property rights that might prove uncomfortable for a man in your position." Before Wyeth could respond, the sound of running feet announced the arrival of the Fletcher boys, who'd been helping Miguel repair fence in the near pasture. They pulled up short when they saw the stranger, their faces curious but wary. "Boys," Wyeth said carefully, "go help Pete with the horses." "Actually," Blackwood said, his smile returning, "I'd like to meet these young gentlemen. I'm Preston Blackwood, and I knew your parents quite well." Benjamin stepped forward, his 13-year-old instincts sharp enough to sense danger. "You knew our mama and papa?" "Indeed I did." "Fine people, the Fletchers. It's tragic what happened to them, but I'm sure they'd want what's best for you boys now." Blackwood's eyes glittered with malice disguised as concern. "Have you given any thought to what will happen when Mr. Calloway here decides he's had enough of playing guardian? A man like him isn't cut out for family life." "That's enough," Wyeth said sharply, but Blackwood pressed on. "Your Uncle Edgar is quite concerned about you boys. He's been looking everywhere, hoping to provide you with a proper home." The words hit the boys like a physical blow. Benjamin went white. Matthew stepped protectively in front of David, and the youngest Fletcher brother pressed closer to Wyeth's side. "Uncle Edgar." Benjamin's voice was barely a whisper. "But he doesn't want us. He told Papa years ago that children were a burden he couldn't afford." "People change," Blackwood said with false sympathy. "He's remarried now, has a stable home and steady income." Much more suitable than this arrangement. Wyeth's hand came to rest on David's shoulder, a gesture of protection that didn't go unnoticed by anyone present. If Edgar Fletcher wants the boys, he can come speak to me directly. Until then, you're trespassing. Blackwood stood slowly, brushing dust from his expensive suit. Mr. Calloway, I fear you don't understand the delicate nature of your situation. These boys aren't legally yours, and there are people with legitimate claims who might take a dim view of your interference. I'd hate to see this matter end up in court. The threat hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Blackwood tipped his hat mockingly and climbed into his buggy, but his parting words carried the weight of a promise. I'll be in touch, gentlemen. This conversation is far from over. As the buggy disappeared down the ranch road, Wyeth felt the boy's eyes on him, searching his face for reassurance he wasn't sure he could provide. The mention of Uncle Edgar had clearly terrified them, and Blackwood's threats about legal challenges struck at Wyeth's deepest fear, that his growing love for these children would only lead to losing them. Who is Uncle Edgar? He asked quietly. Benjamin's jaw worked as if the words were difficult to force out. Papa's older brother. Lives in Santa Fe, I think. He came to visit once when I was little. Told Papa that having children was foolish when money was tight. Said we'd end up in the poorhouse because Papa was too soft-hearted to make hard choices. Papa got real angry, Matthew added. Told Uncle Edgar to leave and never come back. Said any man who thought children were burdens instead of blessings didn't deserve to be called family. David pressed closer to Wyeth, his small hand clutching the rancher's vest. You won't let him take us, will you? We want to stay here with you. The trust in those dark eyes was almost more than Wyeth could bear. These boys had lost everything, their parents, their home, their sense of security, and now they faced the possibility of being torn away from the only stability they'd found. We need to talk to Dr. Morrison, Wyeth said finally. She understands the law better than I do, and we need to find out exactly what Edgar Fletcher's legal standing is. That evening, after the boys had gone to bed, Wyeth sat alone in his study, staring at the carved wooden horse David had given him. Beside it lay another letter that had arrived with the mail, this one bearing official territorial seals and legal language that made his blood run cold. The letter was from Edgar Fletcher, claiming legal guardianship of his deceased brother's children and demanding their immediate return. It was formal, cold, and backed by territorial law that gave blood relatives priority over unrelated guardians, no matter how well-intentioned. For the first time in years, Wyeth Calloway felt helpless. All his wealth, all his influence in the territory might not be enough to keep 3 orphaned boys with the man they'd come to love as a father. The law, it seemed, cared nothing for the bonds of the heart. He picked up the wooden horse, feeling its smooth surface warm under his touch. Such a simple gift, carved by a child's hands with love and gratitude. Yet it represented everything he stood to lose, the laughter that had returned to his house, the sense of purpose that had reignited in his chest, the family he'd never dared hope to have again. Tomorrow he would ride to town and speak with Dr. Morrison, maybe even consult with the territorial judge. But tonight, alone with his fears and the weight of 3 children's trust, Wyeth Calloway did something he hadn't done in 17 years. He prayed. The confrontation came to a head on a cold December evening when Wyeth found David sitting alone in the barn, tears streaming down his face as he stared at something clutched in his small hands. The boy looked up when he heard footsteps, trying to wipe away the evidence of his distress, but Wyeth had already seen enough to know something was terribly wrong. "What's that you're holding?" Wyeth asked gently, settling down on a hay bale beside the child. David's fingers uncurled reluctantly, revealing a simple gold wedding band that caught the lamplight like a fallen star. "It was my mama's," he whispered. "She gave it to me before the fire. Told me to keep it safe and remember that love never really dies, even when people do." Wyeth's throat tightened as he recognized the weight of such a precious burden for a 10-year-old to carry. "It's beautiful. Your mama must have loved you very much to trust you with something so important." I found it when I was cleaning out my pockets tonight, David continued, his voice breaking. I'd forgotten I had it, with everything that's happened. But seeing it made me remember things, about Mama and Papa, about how we used to be a real family. The words cut through Wyeth like a blade, sharp with the pain of recognition. He knew exactly what David meant, because he too carried the weight of lost love, hidden away where it couldn't hurt anymore, or so he'd thought. We are a real family, Wyeth said quietly, the words coming from some deep, previously guarded place in his heart. Different than what you had before, maybe, but real all the same. David looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for his face. But what if Uncle Edgar comes for us? Benjamin heard Miguel talking to Dr. Morrison about the law, about how blood relatives have more rights than people who just care about us. The raw fear in the child's voice made Wyeth's chest ache. These boys had already lost so much, and now they lived in constant dread of losing the only security they'd found. It wasn't fair, wasn't right, and it sparked something fierce and protective in Wyeth's heart. David, he said carefully, there's something I need to tell you about my own family, about why I live alone in this big house. The boy settled closer, sensing the importance of whatever revelation was coming. Wyeth reached into his vest pocket and withdrew something he'd carried for 17 years, a simple silver wedding band. Worn smooth by time and grief. This was my wife's ring, Wyeth said, his voice rough with emotion. Her name was Catherine, and she was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. Had a laugh like music and a heart big enough to love the whole world. David's eyes widened as he stared at the ring. What happened to her? She died, Wyeth said simply. Along with our son Thomas. He was about your age when the fever took them both. I was away on business, chasing profit when I should have been home taking care of them. The pain in Wyeth's voice was so raw that David instinctively reached out and took the older man's weathered hand in his small one. I'm sorry. That must have hurt something terrible. It did, Wyeth admitted. So much that I swore I'd never let myself care about anyone that way again. Built walls around my heart so high I thought nothing could scale them. Until 3 dusty boys showed up at my gate and reminded me what it felt like to be needed. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 souls bonded by loss and the fragile hope of new beginnings. Finally, David spoke. Do you think Mama and Papa would like you? And Dr. Morrison? I think they would. Mama always said the measure of a man wasn't in his money, but in his willingness to help others. The mention of Dr. Morrison brought a flush to Wyeth's cheeks that had nothing to do with the cold. Elena Morrison had become a frequent visitor to the ranch, ostensibly to check on the boy's health, but increasingly to share quiet conversations with Wyeth on the front porch. She was intelligent, compassionate, and possessed of a strength that came from surviving her own losses. Dr. Morrison is a fine woman, Wyeth said carefully. She's been good to you boys. She looks at you the way Mama used to look at Papa, David said, with the startling perceptiveness of childhood. Like you're something special that she's grateful to have found. Before Wyeth could respond to that observation, the barn door opened and Benjamin and Matthew hurried in, their faces tight with worry. There's a man at the house, Benjamin said without preamble. Says he's Uncle Edgar come to take us home. Miguel told him you were out here and sent us to warn you. Wyeth felt his blood turn to ice. Edgar Fletcher's arrival could only mean one thing. The legal challenge they'd all been dreading was about to begin in earnest. He stood slowly, his mind already working through options and strategies. Boys, he said firmly, I want you to stay here with Miguel while I talk to your uncle. No matter what he says, no matter what promises or threats he makes, remember that you have a choice in this. The law may favor blood relatives, but it also considers the best interests of the children involved. What if he tries to make us go with him tonight? Matthew asked, his voice barely steady. He won't, Wyeth said with more confidence than he felt. Not if I have anything to say about it. The walk to the house felt like a funeral march, each step bringing Wyeth closer to a confrontation that could shatter the fragile family they'd built. Edgar Fletcher was exactly what he'd expected, a thin, sharp-faced man in his 50s. Well-dressed but with the calculating eyes of someone who saw everything in terms of profit and loss. "Mr. Calloway," Edgar said without preamble, "I've come for my nephews. I appreciate your charity in caring for them, but family obligations must take precedence." "Funny thing about family obligations," Wyeth replied coldly. "The boys tell me you disowned their father years ago, called children a burden you couldn't afford." Edgar's smile was thin and humorless. "People change, Mr. Calloway. I've remarried, have stable employment, and can provide those boys with proper guidance and education." "What can you offer them?" "The life of ranch hands, manual labor and isolation." "Love," Wyeth said simply. "Security, a home where they're wanted, not just tolerated." Sentiment is touching, but hardly practical. "I have legal guardianship papers from the territorial court. Those boys belong with their blood family, not with a stranger who took them in on a whim." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Morrison's buggy, and Wyeth felt a surge of relief at the sight of her determined face. Helena Morrison had become more than just the boys' physician. She'd become their advocate, their defender, and if Wyeth was honest with himself, the woman who'd helped him remember what it meant to hope for the future. "Mr. Fletcher," she said coolly as she climbed down from her buggy, "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Edgar's expression shifted subtly, and Wyeth caught a flicker of something that might have been nervousness. "Dr. Morrison, I'm here on family business, collecting my nephews." "Interesting," Helena said, pulling a sheaf of papers from her medical bag. "Because according to my research into territorial family law, there are several factors the court must consider before awarding guardianship. Financial stability, yes, but also emotional suitability, the wishes of the children themselves, and the quality of their current care." Edgar's confidence wavered slightly. "The boys are minors. Their wishes are irrelevant under the law." "Actually," Helena continued, "children over the age of 12 can petition the court to express their preferences. And I have here testimonials from their teacher, the local sheriff, and several prominent citizens attesting to their excellent care and remarkable improvement under Mr. Calloway's guardianship." For the first time, Edgar Fletcher looked genuinely worried. Whatever scheme he'd been planning clearly hadn't accounted for organized opposition or legal preparation. "Furthermore," Helena pressed on, "I've taken the liberty of investigating your background. Mr. Fletcher, it's curious how your sudden interest in your nephews coincides with certain business dealings involving land speculation and development companies." The words hit like thunderbolts, and Wyeth saw the pieces of Preston Blackwood's puzzle suddenly falling into place. Edgar Fletcher wasn't here out of familial duty. He was here as part of Blackwood's scheme to force Wyeth off his land. "I don't know what you're implying," Edgar blustered. But his face had gone pale. "I'm not implying anything," Helena said firmly. "I'm stating facts. And the fact is, these boys have found a loving home with a man who genuinely cares for their welfare. Any attempt to remove them for ulterior motives will be met with the full force of territorial law." As if summoned by the confrontation, the three Fletcher boys appeared at the edge of the porch, their faces set with determination that reminded Wyeth of their late father's stubborn streak. "Uncle Edgar," Benjamin said formally, "we appreciate your concern, but we've made our choice. Mr. Calloway is our family now, and we're staying here." The simple declaration, backed by the unwavering support of his brothers, sealed Edgar Fletcher's defeat. Whatever legal maneuvering he'd planned crumbled in the face of the boy's clear preference and the mounting evidence of his questionable motives. "This isn't over," Edgar said as he climbed back into his rented buggy. "There are other avenues, other considerations." "Yes, there are," Helena said quietly. "And I suggest you explore them very carefully before proceeding. Good evening, Mr. Fletcher." As the buggy disappeared into the gathering darkness, Wyeth felt the boys cluster around him like chicks seeking shelter. Helena's hand found his arm, warm and reassuring, and for the first time in months he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd found a way to keep their family together. The document arrived 3 days after Edgar Fletcher's humiliating retreat, delivered by a nervous clerk from the Territorial Land Office, who seemed eager to complete his task and escape. Wyeth accepted the official envelope with growing dread, recognizing the formal seals and heavy paper that indicated serious legal business. Dr. Morrison was having tea with the boys in the kitchen when Wyeth opened the letter, and his sharp intake of breath brought her immediately to his side. What she saw in his face made her blood run cold. Not anger or frustration, but the hollow-eyed shock of a man whose world had just crumbled beneath his feet. "What is it?" she asked quietly, mindful of the children's presence nearby. Wyeth's hands trembled slightly as he held out the document, a deed of trust, yellowed with age and bearing official territorial seals. The carefully inscribed words seemed to burn themselves into his vision. James Fletcher, rightful heir to the property known as Fletcher's Rest, comprising 15,000 acres of grazing land and water rights in the territory of New Mexico. "I don't understand," Helena whispered, scanning the document with growing horror. "This describes your ranch, the exact boundaries, the water sources, everything." "Because it is my ranch," Wyeth said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away. Or rather, it was their ranch. The Fletcher family ranch that James lost in a card game 23 years ago. The revelation hit Helena like a physical blow. She stared at the deed, then at Wyeth's stricken face, then at the three boys who were still laughing over something David had carved, blissfully unaware that their world was about to shatter again. "You mean," Helena's voice caught, "you mean this land originally belonged to their grandfather?" "Jacob Fletcher," Wyeth confirmed, his voice hollow. "James and Edgar's father. According to this, he held clear title until 1861, when he gambled it away in a poker game in Santa Fe. The man who won it sold it to my father 6 months later." Helena's mind raced through the implications. "But that would mean that everything I've built, everything I own, sits on land that should have belonged to those boys' father." Wyeth's laugh was bitter and broken. "That I've been living off their family's legacy while playing the generous benefactor. God, what kind of man does that make me?" The sound of approaching footsteps announced Preston Blackwood's arrival, his satisfied smile suggesting he'd been watching the house and waiting for precisely this moment. Behind him walked a tall, severe-looking man in judicial robes whom Helena recognized as Territorial Judge Harrison Wells. "Mr. Calloway," Blackwood said with false sympathy, "I trust you've had time to review the documents we've uncovered. Fascinating bit of local history, wouldn't you say?" Wyeth stepped onto the porch, his face a mask of stone, despite the turmoil Helena knew was raging inside him. "What do you want, Blackwood?" "Justice, of course," Blackwood replied smoothly. "The Fletcher boys deserve to know the truth about their heritage, don't you think? About how their grandfather built this ranch from nothing, only to lose it to gambling and drink. About how their father grew up in poverty while another man grew rich on his family's land." Judge Wells stepped forward, his expression grave but not unsympathetic. "Mr. Calloway, I've reviewed the documentation Mr. Blackwood has provided. The deed appears to be authentic, and the chain of ownership he's outlined is legally sound. However, the statute of limitations on property claims typically runs 20 years, and, unless fraud can be proven," Blackwood interrupted smoothly, "which it can be in this case. You see, Jacob Fletcher was deliberately given alcohol and laudanum by the men who wanted his land. The poker game was rigged, the documentation falsified. What appeared to be a legal transfer of property was actually theft, pure and simple." Helena felt her heart sink as she saw the trap closing around them. Blackwood had clearly spent months, maybe years, researching and preparing this moment. Every legal angle had been anticipated, every potential defense blocked. But why? Wyeth asked, his voice barely controlled. "What's your endgame here, Blackwood? You don't care about the Fletcher boys or their rights." Blackwood's mask slipped slightly, revealing the calculating predator beneath. "The territorial government is planning a railroad line through this valley. Mr. Calloway, your ranch sits directly in the path of progress. and certain investors, myself included, stand to make considerable profits from the development rights. You've been stubbornly resistant to our generous offers, so we found another way to achieve our goals. Through the boys, Helena said, understanding flooding through her like ice water. You're planning to claim guardianship of them and their inherited property. Edgar Fletcher has proven unreliable, Blackwood admitted. But fortunately, the territorial government has provisions for appointing trustees when minor children inherit valuable property. Trustees who understand the importance of development and progress. The front door opened behind them, and Benjamin Fletcher stepped onto the porch, his young face pale but determined. Behind him, Matthew and David pressed close, their eyes wide with confusion and growing fear. We heard voices. Benjamin said quietly, "Is something wrong?" Wyeth's heart broke as he looked at the three boys who'd become his sons in all but name. How could he tell them that their presence in his life had been built on a foundation of stolen land? How could he explain that loving them might cost them everything they'd found? "Boys," he said carefully, "this is Judge Wells, and he's brought some information about your family that we need to discuss." "What kind of information?" Matthew asked, his protective instincts already alert to danger. Judge Wells cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Young men, it appears that this ranch originally belonged to your grandfather, Jacob Fletcher. Your father would have inherited it if certain irregularities hadn't occurred in the transfer of ownership." David stepped forward, his small hand slipping into Wyeth's with complete trust. "Does that mean we're rich? Like Mr. Calloway?" "It means," Blackwood said with false kindness, "that you boys are the rightful owners of this property, and as your legal guardians, the territorial government will ensure that your inheritance is properly managed." "But we don't want the ranch," Benjamin said, his voice rising with panic. "We want to stay with Mr. Calloway. He's our family now." "Family doesn't steal from children," Blackwood replied cruelly, "even if they do it unknowingly." The words hit Wyeth like physical blows, but it was the look on the boys' faces that truly destroyed him. Confusion, betrayal, and dawning horror as they began to understand the implications of what they'd just learned. "Is it true?" David whispered, his dark eyes searching Wyeth's face. "Did you know the ranch was supposed to be ours?" "No," Wyeth said firmly. "I had no idea until today." "But that doesn't change the facts. This land belonged to your family, and I've been living on it for 23 years. Helena watched the careful bonds they'd built begin to fray as doubt crept into the boys' minds. She could see them struggling to reconcile their love for Wyeth with the devastating revelation of their family's lost inheritance. "What happens now?" Benjamin asked, his 13-year-old voice trying to sound adult and failing. Judge Wells looked genuinely sorry as he replied, "The territorial government will need to investigate the original transfer and determine the proper legal remedy. In the meantime, custody arrangements for you boys will need to be reviewed." "Reviewed by whom?" Helena demanded. "By the Territorial Board of Trustees," Blackwood said with obvious satisfaction, "who will, of course, take into account the boys' substantial property holdings when making their decision." As the full scope of Blackwood's scheme became clear, Helena felt a cold fury building in her chest. He'd found a way to steal both the boys and their land, all while claiming to serve their best interests. But as she looked at Wyeth's stricken face and the boys' confused hurt, she realized that winning this battle would require more than legal maneuvering. It would require something Blackwood hadn't counted on: the power of a family's love for each other, blood relation or not. The war for the Fletcher boys' future had only just begun. The cavalry saber had belonged to Wyeth's father, carried through 3 campaigns and 2 wars before finding its place of honor above the fireplace in the ranch house. Now, as Wyeth lifted it down from its mounting, the weight of the blade seemed to carry the accumulated honor of generations, men who'd faced impossible odds and emerged victorious through courage, determination, and an unshakable sense of what was right. 2 weeks had passed since Preston Blackwood's devastating revelation. 2 weeks during which the very foundation of their lives had been called into question. The boys remained at the ranch while the territorial court deliberated, but the easy comfort of their previous routine had been replaced by a strained politeness that broke Wyeth's heart. They were still respectful, still obedient, but the spontaneous affection that had made his house feel like a home again had been replaced by uncertainty and doubt. "You don't have to give up everything," Benjamin had said the night after Judge Wells' visit, his young voice heavy with the weight of unwanted responsibility. "The ranch is ours by right, but that doesn't mean we want to take it from you. You've been good to us." The careful distance in the boy's words had been more painful than any accusation. Wyeth could see the internal struggle in Benjamin's face, the conflict between gratitude for Wyeth's care and the bitter knowledge that his family's legacy had been built on his grandfather's loss, Helena. Morrison had become their anchor during those dark days, researching territorial law with the determination of a general planning a campaign. Her medical practice suffered as she spent long hours in the territorial archives, tracking down deeds, court records, and witness testimonies from 23 years past. "There has to be something," she'd insisted to Wyeth during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "Blackwood's too confident, too smooth. Men like him always leave a trail of corruption if you know where to look." Now, on the morning of the custody hearing that would determine the boy's future, Wyeth found himself holding his father's saber and thinking about honor, both lost and found. The blade had seen him through the darkest periods of his life, a reminder that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. A soft knock at the study door interrupted his contemplation. David Fletcher stood in the doorway, his small frame almost lost in the oversized work clothes Miguel had found for him. In his hands, he held something wrapped in a piece of old cloth. "I wanted to give you this," David said quietly, stepping into the room with the careful politeness that had replaced his former easy affection. Before whatever happens today." Wyeth set down the saber and accepted the wrapped bundle, his heart already aching at the formal distance in the child's manner. Inside the cloth was a wooden carving unlike any David had made before. A perfect miniature of the ranch house, complete with tiny windows, a detailed front porch, and even a microscopic version of the weather vane that topped the barn. "It's beautiful," Wyeth said, his voice rougher than he intended. "The detail is extraordinary. I wanted you to have something to remember us by," David said, his dark eyes bright with unshed tears. In case we have to go away." The words hit Wyeth like physical blows. In the space of 2 weeks, he'd gone from the happiest he'd been in 17 years to facing the loss of everything that mattered. The boy's future, their trust, even his own sense of moral certainty, all of it hung in the balance. "David," he said carefully, "no matter what happens today, I want you to know that these past months have been the best of my life since your Aunt Catherine and Cousin Thomas died. You boys gave me back something I thought was lost forever." David's composure cracked slightly. "Then why does it feel like everything's breaking apart? If you love us and we love you, why can't that be enough?" Before Wyeth could answer, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of Helena's buggy, followed closely by a territorial marshal's wagon that would escort them to the courthouse in Santa Fe. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The courtroom was packed with spectators, drawn by the unusual nature of the case, orphaned children claiming their inheritance, while fighting to stay with the man who'd taken them in. Preston Blackwood sat at the prosecutor's table with 2 expensive lawyers from Denver, their confidence evident in every gesture and whispered consultation. Across from them, Helena Morrison had secured the services of Marcus Kane, an elderly attorney whose reputation for integrity and tenacity had made him legendary throughout the territory. Kane was past 70, white-haired and bent with age, but his eyes still held the fire of a man who'd spent his life fighting for justice. Judge Wells called the hearing to order with obvious reluctance. Wyeth could see the conflict in the man's face, the desire to do what was legally correct, warring with his understanding of what was morally right. "This court is convened to determine the custody and property," Rights of Benjamin, Matthew, and David Fletcher. Orphaned minors, Wells announced. Mr. Blackwood as the petitioning party. You may present your case. Blackwood rose with theatrical precision. His opening statement, a masterpiece of legal manipulation, disguised as righteous concern for the children's welfare. He painted Wyeth as a well-meaning but unqualified guardian who'd unknowingly built his fortune on stolen land, while positioning the territorial trustees as the boys' only hope for proper care and education. These children deserve more than life as ranch hands, Blackwood declared. They deserve the full benefits of their inheritance, properly managed by qualified professionals who understand their true worth. The implication was clear. Wyeth was a simple rancher, unsuited to manage the complex financial interests that came with valuable property holdings. It was a clever argument that played on class prejudices and legal technicalities, while ignoring the human cost of separating a family. When Marcus Kane rose to respond, his first move surprised everyone in the courtroom. "Your Honor," the old lawyer said, "I'd like to call Miguel Herrera to the stand." Miguel stepped forward with obvious nervousness, his weathered hands clasped tightly as he took the oath. Kane's questioning was gentle but methodical, drawing out the story of the boys' arrival at the ranch and their transformation under Wyeth's care. "In your opinion, Señor Herrera," Kane asked, "how would you describe the relationship between Mr. Calloway and the Fletcher boys?" "Like padre y hijos," Miguel replied without hesitation. "Father and sons. The patron. He was a broken man before those boys came. Now he has purpose, has joy. And the boys, they bloom like flowers in the desert. They are family." One by one, Kane called witnesses who painted a picture of genuine love and mutual devotion. Pete Donovan testified about the boys' eagerness to learn and their obvious affection for Wyeth. The schoolteacher spoke of their academic progress and emotional stability. Even several townspeople who'd initially been skeptical of Wyeth's motives admitted they'd been wrong in their judgment. But it was Helena Morrison's testimony that provided the bombshell everyone had been waiting. "For Dr. Morrison," Kane said carefully, "you've conducted extensive research into the original transfer of the Fletcher property. What did you discover?" Helena pulled out a thick folder of documents, her expression grim with purpose. "Your Honor, I found evidence of systematic fraud dating back to 1861. Jacob Fletcher didn't lose his ranch in a fair poker game. He was deliberately drugged and robbed by a conspiracy that included territorial officials, land speculators, and corrupt gamblers." A murmur of shock rippled through the courtroom. Blackwood's confident expression faltered as Helena continued. "Furthermore, I discovered that the same group was responsible for similar schemes throughout the territory, stealing land from Mexican and Native American families through fraudulent legal proceedings. Mr. Blackwood's current development company is the direct descendant of that criminal conspiracy." Kane approached the witness, stand with a document that made Blackwood go pale. "Dr. Morrison, what is this paper you've uncovered?" "A confession," Helena said clearly, "written by one of the original conspirators before his death in 1879. He detailed the entire scheme, including the names of everyone involved and the methods they used to steal Jacob Fletcher's ranch." The courtroom erupted in chaos as Blackwood's lawyers objected frantically, but Judge Wells gavelled for order with growing interest. If Helena's evidence proved authentic, it would change everything about the case. "Your Honor," Kane said with quiet authority, "this confession proves that the Fletcher family never legally lost their property. The entire chain of ownership is based on fraud and theft. My clients, the Fletcher boys, are indeed the rightful owners of the ranch. But," he continued, turning to face the packed courtroom, "ownership and guardianship are separate issues. These boys have chosen their family, and the law should respect that choice." As Helena stepped down from the witness stand, Wyeth caught her eye and saw the mixture of hope and fear that he felt in his own heart. They'd proven the boys' legal right to their inheritance, but the battle for their family was far from over. Preston Blackwood's empire of corruption was crumbling, but a desperate man with everything to lose could still do tremendous damage. The real fight was just beginning. The original land survey map spread across Judge Wells' bench like a roadmap to truth, its faded ink and careful measurements telling a story that predated Preston Blackwood's corruption by decades. Helena Morrison had found it in the territorial archives, buried beneath years of bureaucratic filing and deliberate misdirection. But its message was unmistakably clear. "Your Honor," Marcus Kane said, his voice carrying the authority of righteous indignation, "this survey map, commissioned by the territorial government in 1859, clearly shows Jacob Fletcher as the rightful owner of the property in question. Every boundary marker, every water right, every acre is documented with his name and signature." Judge Wells studied the map with growing amazement, comparing it to the modern surveys Blackwood's lawyers had submitted. The discrepancies were glaring. Sections of land that had been mysteriously transferred, water rights that had changed hands without proper documentation, boundaries that had been shifted to favor certain buyers. Furthermore, Kane continued, producing another document. "We have the original homestead filing that Jacob Fletcher submitted to the Territorial Land Office in 1857. This shows a continuous chain of legal ownership that was never properly broken. Despite the fraudulent poker game that Mr. Blackwood's associates claim legitimized the transfer." Preston Blackwood rose from his seat, his face flushed with desperation and barely controlled anger. "Your Honor, these documents are ancient history. Regardless of how the original transfer occurred, the current ownership has been legally established for over 20 years. The statute of limitations clearly applies, not in cases of proven fraud," Judge Wells replied sternly. "Dr. Morrison's research has uncovered evidence of a systematic conspiracy to defraud territorial landowners. That changes the legal standing considerably." Benjamin Fletcher stood up in the gallery, his young voice cutting through the legal arguments with startling clarity. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Judge Wells looked surprised but nodded. "You may approach the bench, young man." Benjamin walked forward with the bearing of someone far older than his 13 years, his brothers flanking him in silent support. When he reached the front of the courtroom, he turned to face not just the judge, but the entire assembled crowd. "Your Honor, my brothers and I have listened to all these arguments about land and money and legal rights, and we understand that this ranch was supposed to be our inheritance, that our grandfather lost it through trickery and theft. But there's something everyone seems to be forgetting." He paused, his voice gaining strength as he continued. "Mr. Calloway didn't steal our land. He didn't know about the fraud any more than we did. He's the man who took us in when we had nowhere else to go, who fed us and clothed us and gave us a home when the whole world seemed against us." Matthew stepped forward to stand beside his older brother. "He taught us what it means to be a family again, not because we're related by blood, but because we chose each other." David, the youngest, moved to complete the trio, his small voice carrying remarkable conviction. "We don't want the ranch if it means losing him. Money can't buy what we have together." The simple honesty of their words seemed to reverberate through the courtroom like a bell tolling for justice. Even Judge Wells appeared moved by their declaration, his stern judicial demeanor softening slightly. Dr. Morrison rose from her seat, her medical bag in hand. "Your Honor, if I may add something to the boy's testimony?" At the judge's nod, she approached the bench with the confidence of someone who'd spent years advocating for her patients' well-being. "I've been treating these children since they arrived at Mr. Calloway's ranch, and I've documented their remarkable recovery from the trauma of losing their parents. When they first came to me, they showed classic signs of grief, malnutrition, and psychological distress. Today, they're healthy, happy, and emotionally stable children who found security and love in an unconventional but genuine family." She turned to face Preston Blackwood directly, her brown eyes blazing with righteous anger. Mr. Blackwood's scheme would tear these children away from the only stability they've known since their parents' death, all for the sake of profit and land speculation. That's not justice. That's institutionalized child abuse. The courtroom buzzed with murmured agreement from the spectators. many of whom were Cedar Falls residents who'd witnessed the boys' transformation firsthand. Sheriff Tom Bradley stood up in the back, his badge glinting in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Judge Wells, I'd like to add that my investigation into Mr. Blackwood's business dealings has uncovered evidence of bribery, intimidation, and fraud extending far beyond this case. The Territorial Attorney's Office will be filing formal charges within the week. Blackwood's lawyers huddled frantically around their client, their confident demeanor cracking under the weight of mounting evidence and public disapproval. What had seemed like a straightforward legal proceeding was rapidly becoming an exposé of territorial corruption that threatened to destroy Blackwood's entire empire. Your Honor, Kane said with quiet satisfaction, I believe the evidence clearly shows that my clients, the Fletcher boys, are indeed the rightful owners of the disputed property. But more importantly, they've exercised their legal right to choose their guardian, and that choice is Wyeth Calloway. Judge Wells nodded slowly, his decision already forming in his mind. The law was complex, but justice was simple. These children belonged with the man who loved them, regardless of the legal technicalities surrounding property ownership. Judge Wells raised his gavel, and the courtroom fell silent as everyone waited for the decision that would determine the Fletcher boys' future. Wyeth felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched the judge's weathered face, searching for any hint of which way the ruling would fall. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, Judge Wells began, his voice carrying the weight of territorial law. This court finds that the original transfer of the Fletcher property was indeed fraudulent, and that Benjamin, Matthew, and David Fletcher are the rightful heirs to their grandfather's estate. A murmur of satisfaction rippled through the courtroom, but Wyeth felt his stomach drop. Legal ownership was one thing, custody was another entirely. However, the judge continued, raising his hand for silence, the question of guardianship must be decided based on the best interests of the children involved. The territorial statutes are clear that children over the age of 12 may express their preference regarding custody arrangements, provided that preference serves their overall welfare. Benjamin straightened his shoulders, preparing to speak again, but Judge Wells held up his hand. Young man, you and your brothers have made your wishes abundantly clear. But before I render my final decision, I want to address the broader implications of this case. The judge's gaze swept across the packed courtroom, taking in the faces of townspeople, officials, and spectators who'd come to witness this unusual proceeding. For too long, this territory has tolerated corruption masquerading as legitimate business. Men like Preston Blackwood have grown rich by exploiting legal loopholes and preying on the vulnerable. Today, that ends. Blackwood started to object, but Judge Wells silenced him with a look that could have frozen fire. Mr. Blackwood, your association with the fraudulent activities that robbed the Fletcher family of their inheritance makes you an unfit candidate for any involvement in these children's lives. Furthermore, I'm ordering a full investigation into your business practices and recommending that the territorial attorney pursue criminal charges. The judge turned his attention back to the Fletcher boys, his stern expression softening slightly. As for custody, this court recognizes that families are built on love and commitment, not merely blood relations. These boys have found a home with Wyeth Calloway, and their emotional well-being clearly depends on maintaining that relationship. Judge Wells paused, looking directly at Wyeth with an expression that mixed respect and understanding. Mr. Calloway, this court awards you full legal guardianship of Benjamin, Matthew, and David Fletcher, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. Furthermore, as the boys' legal guardian, you will serve as trustee of their inherited property until they reach majority age. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause as the Fletcher boys rushed to Wyeth's side, their faces bright with relief and joy. David threw his arms around Wyeth's waist, while Benjamin and Matthew pressed close, their formal distance finally melting away. But there's more, Judge Wells continued, raising his voice over the celebration. Dr. Morrison's research has revealed that several other families in this territory have been victims of similar fraudulent schemes. I'm ordering a comprehensive review of all land transfers connected to Mr. Blackwood's associates, and I'm establishing a special territorial commission to investigate and remedy these injustices." Preston Blackwood stood abruptly, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "This is preposterous." "You can't overturn decades of established property law based on the sentimental whims of—" "I can and I will," Judge Wells said firmly. "Justice delayed is not justice denied. Mr. Blackwood, the people of this territory deserve better than the corruption you've represented." As territorial marshals moved to escort Blackwood from the courtroom, he turned back toward Wyeth with venomous hatred. "This isn't over, Calloway. You may have won today, but there are other ways to—" "Actually," Dr. Morrison said, rising from her seat with a document in her hand, "it is over. Completely." She approached the bench with the confidence of someone holding a winning hand. "Your Honor, I have here a commission from the territorial governor appointing me as the new administrator for land fraud investigations. Mr. Blackwood's assets have been frozen pending criminal proceedings, and his development company has been dissolved." The final blow landed like a thunderclap. Blackwood's empire, built on decades of theft and corruption, had crumbled in a single afternoon. As the marshals led him away, his threats dissolved into impotent rage. Judge Wells smiled for the first time during the entire proceeding. "Dr. Morrison, the territory is fortunate to have someone of your integrity taking on this important work." As the courtroom began to empty, Wyeth found himself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters from Cedar Falls, but his attention was focused entirely on the three boys who'd transformed his life from empty routine into purposeful joy. "So," he said quietly, kneeling down to David's level, "it looks like you're stuck with me permanently now. Think you can handle that?" David's answer came in the form of a fierce hug that nearly knocked Wyeth over. "We're a real family now, aren't we?" "Legal and everything?" "Legal and everything," Wyeth confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. Benjamin stepped forward with the wooden figurine that had started David's artistic journey, a new carving that depicted not a single horse, but an entire family group. A tall man in a cowboy hat, three boys of different sizes, and a woman in a doctor's coat, all standing together in front of a detailed, miniature ranch house. "David made this for all of us," Benjamin said, offering the carving to Wyeth. "He calls it the Calloway Fletcher family portrait." As Wyeth accepted the gift, he noticed that Dr. Morrison had moved to stand beside him, a hand resting gently on Matthew's shoulder. The carved family seemed to perfectly capture not just what they were, but what they were becoming. "Helena," Wyeth said quietly, turning to face the woman who'd fought so hard for their happiness. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you." The boys exchanged knowing glances as Wyeth reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small velvet box that had belonged to his grandmother. Inside, a simple but elegant gold ring caught the afternoon light streaming through the courthouse windows. "Would you consider making this family complete?" he asked, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Helena's answer came in the form of tears, laughter, and a kiss that sealed not just their engagement, but the final piece of their unconventional family puzzle. As they walked out of the courthouse together, five people who'd found each other across loss, trauma, and impossible odds, David looked up at his new father with complete contentment. "Papa," he said, the word coming naturally for the first time, "are we going home now?" "Yes," Wyeth replied, his heart fuller than he'd ever thought possible. "We're going home." 6 months later, the bronze bell rang clear and true across the Calloway Fletcher ranch, its melodious voice carrying news of celebration to every corner of the 15,000 acres that had finally returned to their rightful owners. Inscribed around its rim in careful script were the words, "Where family begins," a testament to the truth that home isn't a place you're born to, but a place you choose to build. The wedding ceremony took place in the front yard of the ranch house, beneath the same oak tree where Wyeth had first seen 3 dusty, desperate children begging for help. Dr. Helena Morrison had become Helena Calloway in a simple ceremony officiated by the territorial chaplain, with Benjamin, Matthew, and David serving as groomsmen, and the entire population of Cedar Falls in attendance. The town itself had experienced a renaissance since Preston Blackwood's downfall. The Territorial Land Commission had restored property to dozens of families who'd been victims of fraudulent schemes, and new businesses had begun to flourish as people felt secure in their holdings once again. The Silver Dollar Saloon had been renovated, Murphy's General Store had expanded, and there was even talk of establishing a proper school with multiple teachers. "You know," Helena said, as she and Wyeth stood on their front porch, watching their 3 sons practice roping techniques with Miguel and Carlos. "I never imagined my life would turn out like this when I came west." Wyeth slipped his arm around his new wife's waist, marveling at how natural the gesture felt. "Regrets? Only that it took us so long to find each other," she replied, leaning into his warmth, "though I suppose we all needed to be ready for this kind of love." In the months since the court case, the boys had flourished in ways that went beyond simple happiness. Benjamin had grown into his role as the oldest, taking on more responsibility around the ranch while maintaining his studies. He'd developed a keen interest in the business side of cattle, ranching, and spent his evenings poring over breeding records and market reports with the intensity of a born entrepreneur. Matthew had found his calling with the horses, displaying an almost mystical ability to understand and communicate with the animals. Pete Donovan had taken him on as an unofficial apprentice, teaching him the subtle arts of horse training and veterinary care. The boy's quiet intelligence and gentle nature made him a natural healer, and Helena had begun teaching him basic medical skills as well. David, now 11, had become the ranch's official woodcarver, his artistic skills developing at an astonishing rate under Miguel's patient tutelage. His carvings had progressed from simple animals to intricate scenes that captured the essence of ranch life with remarkable detail. Several pieces had been sold in Santa Fe, earning him a small but growing reputation as a genuine artist. But it was the changes in Wyeth himself that were perhaps most remarkable. The cold, isolated man who'd reluctantly taken in 3 orphaned children had been replaced by a father who delighted in his sons' accomplishments and took pride in their growing independence. His laughter had returned, along with a sense of purpose that went far beyond mere survival. "Papa," David called from the corral, where he was attempting to rope a patient old mare. "Watch this." The lasso sailed wide of its target, landing in the dust with a soft thud, but Wyeth's applause was enthusiastic and genuine. "Better form this time. Keep your elbows straight and follow through. He's improving," Benjamin observed, coiling his own rope with practiced efficiency. "Remember when he couldn't even hold the lasso properly?" "I remember when you couldn't either," Matthew said with a grin. "Took you a month before you could rope anything bigger than a fence post." The easy banter between the brothers was music to Wyeth's ears. These boys had found their way back to childhood after the trauma of loss and displacement, and their joy was infectious. As evening approached, the family gathered around the dinner table that had once accommodated only Wyeth's solitary meals. Now it was alive with conversation, laughter, and the comfortable chaos of a large family sharing their day's experiences. The Hendersons sent word that their mare is ready to foal, Helena reported as she served the roast beef that had become a Sunday tradition. They'd like Matthew to be there when it happens, since he's developed such a way with horses. Matthew's face lit up with pride and excitement. "Really? They trust me to help with a birthing?" "You've earned that trust," Wyeth said firmly. "Your skill with animals is remarkable for someone your age." After dinner, as was their custom, the family gathered in the living room, where David would share his latest carving, and Benjamin would read aloud from whatever book had captured his attention. Tonight, David presented a miniature replica of the courthouse in Santa Fe, complete with tiny figures representing their family standing on the front steps. "I wanted to remember the day we all became legal," David explained, his dark eyes bright with satisfaction. When the judge said we could stay together forever, Wyeth accepted the carving with the reverence it deserved, adding it to the growing collection that documented their life together. Each piece told a story, their first Christmas as a family, the day Helena's medical practice reopened in town, the celebration when Benjamin's essay won the territorial writing contest. You know, Benjamin said thoughtfully, sometimes I think about Papa and Mama, about what they'd think of all this. Do you suppose they'd be happy that we found a new family? It was Helena who answered, her voice gentle but certain. I think they'd be grateful that you found love and security. Parents want their children to be happy and safe, and you've found both those things here. Plus, Matthew added with the practical wisdom of a 13-year-old, they'd probably like knowing that we got our family's land back. Papa always said justice has a way of working out in the end. As the boys prepared for bed, following routines that had become as natural as breathing, Wyeth stepped out onto the front porch for his nightly survey of the ranch. The bronze bell caught moonlight, its inscription barely visible in the silver glow, where family begins. It was true, Wyeth reflected. This was where their family had begun, not with blood or legal documents, but with the simple decision to open his heart to 3 children who needed love as much as he needed to give it. The land beneath his feet might have belonged to the Fletcher family by right of inheritance, but the love that bound them together belonged to all of them by right of choice. Helena joined him on the porch, slipping her hand into his as they stood together in comfortable silence. In the distance, cattle lowed softly, and the sound of David's laughter drifted from the boy's bedroom window. Thank you, Wyeth said quietly. For what? For believing that a hard old man could learn to be a father again. For fighting for us when I was too proud to fight for myself. For making this house a home. Helena squeezed his hand, her wedding ring catching the moonlight. We all found exactly what we needed, didn't we? The boys found a father, you found sons, and I found a family worth loving. As they stood together under the vast New Mexican sky, Wyeth Calloway understood that sometimes the greatest treasures come disguised as burdens, and the richest men are those who discover that love, not gold, is the only currency that truly matters. His pocket watch still kept perfect time, but he no longer counted the hours, he savored them, knowing that every moment with his chosen family was a gift beyond price. The bell rang softly in the evening breeze, a gentle reminder that where love dwells, family begins anew each day.